Hi, this is Andrea.
And this is Fiorenza.
Welcome to the Belonging Project podcast. We are so excited to have you here with us.
The purpose of this podcast is to bring voices together to talk about belonging. Through inspiring, real-life conversations with our guests, we learn about how belonging can show up in so many different ways, what it feels like to belong, and the impact of truly belonging.
In each episode, we will offer you inspirational and practical strategies to find your true voice in your life, in society, and as a leader. Let's dive in. And our guest today is Dr. Sandra Upton. She's a Vice President Global Diversity Practice with the Cultural Intelligence Center and is responsible for providing leadership and expertise on diversity, equity, and inclusion matters for Cultural Intelligence Center clients across the globe. She has led educational institutes, governments, and all agencies and no-profits. She has led Cultural Intelligence Center response to growing demand from global companies such as Starbucks, Facebook, Google, McDonald's, FCA, and others. And institutions such as Harvard University, London School of Economics, University of Michigan, Stanford, Columbia, and Cornell University. She has also led the Center Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion work for pre-K and 12 schools, such as Boston Public School and Forest Hill Public Schools. Sandra is also the subject matter expert for the Center work on unconscious bias and has led Centers on Conscious Bias certification programs across the globe. She travels frequently and has consulted with organizations, educational institutions, and schools across the US and around the world, such as in Brazil, China, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Israel, Singapore, South Africa, and several countries in Europe. Dr. Sandra, thank you so much for being here with us. It's such an honor and privilege to hear your story and your knowledge in cross-cultural, the cultural intelligence, and the diversity, equity, inclusion. I'd like to start asking you to share your story with your own words with us.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for inviting me to be a part of this very exciting and much needed project. I think the conversation is so important and it's so timely. And for you to create a platform, another platform where voices can be shared and heard around the world is pretty phenomenal. So I feel honored to be a part of this. So thank you.
Thank you.
So my story, on a personal level, I am here in the States, and it was interesting listening to you read my bio, and you talked about me traveling extensively. That was like pre-COVID. I had on my Facebook page literally just popped up a wonderful trip that I had to Singapore a few years back, and I was looking at the pictures thinking, oh my gosh, when can I go back to Singapore? So looking forward to getting back out there, but technology has saved us somewhat. Yeah. But in terms of my story, on a personal level, I'm here in the States. I was born in the South. And my family moved north just as I was turning 1 year old. So we actually migrated north as part of the Great Migration here in the US, which is where a lot of families of color, in particular African-American families, were moving north to find better opportunities. And so my family was a part of that. So while I was born in the South, I went back many times growing up, my roots really were in the Midwest here in the US. Which is a pretty conservative, predominantly white culture. There is diversity for sure, and that is certainly growing. But even in that, I think just growing up and just how I was raised by a single mother, very close to my extended family. So in my early years, we actually lived with my grandparents. So I had a wonderful village, as we say in the African-American community, or the African culture, really had a wonderful village around me that helped to shape my identity and built in me a very, very strong work ethic. And I always knew that I had a passion for education. There was no question in my mind that I was going to go off to college and attempt to do great things. And so fast forward, I still lived in Michigan, went to a university here in Michigan, and then moved on to the East Coast. And I left Michigan because I wanted, not that I didn't feel a sense of belonging to some extent, but I think about it. I moved to the East Coast, specifically to Washington, D.C., because I longed for more diversity.
Yeah, okay.
So that just kind of popped in my head right now, but that was a big motivation. I knew it was out there, and I wanted to be part of a community where there was a lot more diversity, more people that looked like me, as well as many, many other cultural backgrounds. But when I landed there, that ended me up, started my first work in the education space. And I won't go through every too much, because that'll take a long time, because it's been a long time since those days. But in the short, I ended up working in education for many years. I started work at a small like an educational institution in the DC area. And from there, I just ended up with this trajectory in the education space, ending up back in Michigan with a position at a university, teaching as faculty for many years, and then actually stepping into administration. But even in my role as an administrator in a school of business, I understood then, and it was really important for me as I worked to provide leadership for our business students, and in particular our MBA students, I understood the importance of culture and exposing them to different cultural backgrounds and helping them understand that they needed, if they were going to be successful in today's global and multicultural world, that they needed to have cultural intelligence. Yeah. And so that was always a big part of my passion and commitment, even in education, even before I transitioned back into the corporate space. And today, I'm working full-time in the capacity of vice president, overseeing all of the work that we're doing as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And obviously that involves a lot of conversations around this whole notion of belonging.
Yeah, you are such an inspiration. Like, that's an amazing story. Yeah.
And Dr. Sandra, I'm curious about, because you've mentioned that move to Washington, D.C., and that there was this sense of quest for deeper belonging. I'm curious about that first experience, maybe, and how it was when you arrived in Washington, D.C., and maybe you've experienced that belonging. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. It was like heaven on earth. I was like, this is what I long for. And if you kind of go back, so I moved out there right after I had graduated not from high school, but from college. And I actually had planned to talk about that a little bit later in the conversation. But I went to what we would call here in the US a PWI, which is a predominantly white institution, and very large Midwest institution, 40,000 students. There was some diversity, but students of color were still certainly the minority on campus. And I remember having many moments of not feeling a sense of belonging in that environment, and just thinking about, boy, I can't wait until I graduate, because it was overall a very positive experience. So I want to qualify it by the comments with that. Very positive overall. I've met some wonderful people from many, many cultural backgrounds, which I absolutely love and thrive off of. But generally speaking, I had many moments throughout that experience where I didn't always feel that sense of belonging. And so I knew that when I graduated, I had a choice of staying in the Midwest or exploring other places where I knew that there would be more diversity. So it was heaven on earth, a lot of diversity, and I thrived, did well. I ended up coming back, talk about personal, I ended up coming back to Michigan because my mother got sick. So And thank goodness she's doing fantastic today. But at that time, it was pretty serious and didn't quite know. So that is what brought me back here to the Midwest here in the States. But it was a great experience. And had those circumstances not been as they were, I would likely still be there.
Thank you. And we met at the Cultural Intelligence Center, where you are the vice president. And also for Fiorenza and I, we do the cultural work, and we know that the importance of having this cultural awareness and develop the cultural intelligence. But I would like you to talk a little bit more, even for people who will watch us later. What is this in cultural intelligence, and what is this impact, this relationship, let's say, with the diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Sure, fantastic question. So, I like to start with the basic definition of cultural intelligence, which is the capability to function and relate effectively in any multicultural situation. And the one word that I always emphasize in that definition is capability. So often in this space, even when we're talking about belonging, we talk about this idea of having greater awareness and sensitivity to cultural differences. And those are very important pieces of the puzzle, but we know that none of those guarantee that we're going to be effective. So I can be sensitive to the diversity that's represented in my space. I can be aware of that, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually going to do a good job of engaging in ways that make people feel included or make people feel this sense of belonging. And so cultural intelligence is really the difference maker. It really is the foundation and strategic link whenever you're talking about any of those areas: diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So again, you can't, you can have a very diverse group of people and they look beautiful. On the outside, they look like this amazing mosaic. I mean, we look gorgeous, don't we, ladies?
Yes.
We're from, we're in 3 parts of the world right now. I mean, it's exciting. But if we didn't have cultural intelligence, we would be very limited in our ability to really share in our experiences, understand those experiences, create a space where each of us can feel fully comfortable in bringing our whole selves into that space, into that conversation. So it really is, as we like to describe it, the foundation and strategic link. And there's extensive research to back that up, but just on a very practical level for all 4 of those spaces: D for the diversity, I for the inclusion, E for the equity, and B for the belonging.
Yeah. I love the quote that you share on LinkedIn. Inclusion is not only welcoming everyone, it's having a culture and set of organizational routines that are explicitly inclusive. Yes. So we need much more, diversity is important, but we need more. We need to provide more, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, people still, this belonging word is still pretty new, right? It's sort of risen to the surface in the last couple of years. And I think there are a lot of people who are still a bit confused even about the difference between inclusion and belonging, or they have different definitions, of how they see those terms. And I was thinking about that as I was preparing for our conversation today. And, when I think about inclusion, it's this idea of being invited to a space, or a situation. And that's a good thing. And that takes us beyond diversity, right? Diversity says we want the representation, but then are we actually inviting people to share their voices and their experiences? And then belonging, I think, goes a bit deeper in that it really is something that ultimately creates an emotional outcome, but it's this idea of, you can invite me to a space, but then are you really inviting me to that space? And I was thinking, the analogy that came to my mind was this conversation. You invited me to this conversation, but what if I were to get to this conversation and nothing about your behaviors really made me feel like I belonged? right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe any ideas I had perhaps were not valued or were ignored. Certain parts of my identity were really not embraced. And I didn't feel part of the community of the conversation. And you're not doing that at all. That's why I love the rules that you set up front. There's no right or wrong answers. It's just an authentic conversation. But that is that kind of thing that really, I think, moves us from inclusion to belonging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really love that. Really resonates with that analogy that you've shared there. And you've mentioned your work with leaders before, and you've worked within the education sphere and with corporations as well. Would there be a success story maybe that comes to mind? And I guess we can also define what success means, but a story that comes to mind of an organization and how it was transformed from getting the diversity understood and then the inclusion and then hopefully the belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always say every organization is on a journey and they never fully arrive, just like we never fully arrive as individuals. But I do think there are definitely some organizations out there that are on really good trajectories. Mm-hmm. And there's one in particular, I won't share a name, but I think they've done a really good job of, when you think about that sort of that pathway, you need leadership commitment. To this work, and commitment meaning demonstrated commitment. So not just I'm going to say the words or we're going to put out a public statement, but I'm going to demonstrate it by allocating human capital and allocating financial resources, whatever is necessary in order to really do this work in an authentic and sustainable way. So there is an organization that we work with where leadership has really gotten it and has made that level of demonstrated commitment. So that's a first big step. And then they've done a great job of then rolling out that commitment across the organization and demonstrated and expected that everyone in the organization understands that it's everybody's job. It's not just the leadership's job. It's not just the chief diversity officer or whomever you might have that you've determined is going to lead the work. So this organization has done a good job of that, of really making it clear to everybody in the organization that it's all of our responsibility to support this idea of creating an inclusive and culture that creates a sense of belonging. And then the other key thing that I think they've done is it's one thing to tell people that you have an expectation of them as it relates to this work and that you're going to hold them accountable. But both of those expectations are unfair if you don't give them the resources and support to contribute. And I think that's where a lot of organizations get stuck or don't do that great of a job. And in this case, this organization has done a good job. So they've done that through some learning and development, but then we worked with them to create tools and resources that enable people to feel empowered and more confident, less intimidated by this notion of, okay, so what, I think this is a good thing, but I have no idea what to do. So they've done a really good job of, again, across the organization, providing people at every level the support and resources that they need to contribute to the work. So those are some major things that I've seen this organization. So I would say that they are a success story in the making, right? Yeah. And I think they're farther along than many other organizations that I've seen out there.
Yes, it's really about putting practice, right? Being active, not just in the. Amazing. Thank you for sharing this. And one big topic here in this diversity inclusion, and that is we are talking a lot nowadays, and that you also is an expert, is about unconscious bias. And I see for myself and for my clients as well, this new, I will call new vocabulary is becoming more close. We we are understanding more and more this vocabulary. I had a situation with a client last week, a coach client, and she was saying about her performance review that she had with her manager. And she said, Andrea, I know this is unconscious bias. So I love when people are given the name of what is this means. No? So based on your experience and even your knowledge in that field, what would be strategies for people, for leader organizations, whatever it comes to you? Of course, we cannot save the world, but what is the strategy to overcome this unconscious bias that people are noticing and living? No.
Sure. Yeah. I think the first step is, what you just described with this person acknowledging that it exists, that it's very real and very rampant in our organizations. And I wrote a blog not too long ago. You may have seen it, where I was not trying to slam anyone, but I did highlight a story in the case of a major global company where the leader came under serious fire because they didn't acknowledge, they actually dismissed the reality of it. Now, they were in one way trying to make a point that the training that their employees were participating in was not successful. That's a fair conversation for sure, because we've got some pretty strong thoughts about how unconscious bias training works and doesn't work. But the damage came when there was the suggestion that bias doesn't exist. So that's the first major step, that we have to acknowledge that it's real and that it can be rampant in our organizations across the employee life cycle, and in many other spots. And I think one of the weaknesses sometimes of leaders is that organizational leaders, they have an easier time seeing it outside of their organizations, but a more difficult time acknowledging that it's real in their organization. So that's the first, I think, big thing, is to recognize and acknowledge that it is very real, and that the consequences can be very severe, especially towards marginalized or underrepresented populations. But it can happen to any of us. So it's not isolated to certain groups, although the impact can sometimes be significantly greater with groups that are underrepresented and marginalized. I think the other thing, and this is huge, is that's the missing link in a lot of our conversations and trainings around unconscious bias. And it's why people like this CEO argued that the training doesn't work. It's the approach and the assumption that unconscious bias training by itself is sufficient. And that's just simply not supported by research. And we know that the way we manage our biases is through cultural intelligence. We have to have the skill in order to, and use that framework in order to be able to not only acknowledge our biases, but then literally understand how we can determine strategies to manage those biases. And in practical ways, we know we're always going to have those thoughts, but the key is to control those thoughts so that they don't make their way, especially if they're negative and can have negative impact on others, that they don't make their way into our actions, behaviors, and decisions. So we believe that cultural intelligence is the strategy for managing unconscious bias, and not everybody is there. And so I think that's in part, and not to suggest there aren't some other fabulous trainers out there, but again, the approach and philosophy that we take is very research-based, and we know that it does change behaviors and influence, or it limits the impact that biases can have on decision-making in situations such as a performance review.
Yes, absolutely. I do believe that.
Yeah. And here again, what I'm hearing is there's the concept, and once you are given the words and you understand what the words mean, what it means to have an unconscious bias, and how it feels when you realize you have one or many, but that is still in the conceptual phase. But then you need tools and strategies to put this into practice, and this is what you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a mindset and it's a framework that you can use. I share a story. I've shared this in a blog as well. And in a lot of the trainings that I facilitate, I often will start my trainings out, particularly when I'm doing an unconscious bias training, with the story of how I was at an event with my colleague who is the president of our company, who happens to be a Caucasian male. And we were at an event. My husband and I went to an event in his home and sat down at a table with an elderly woman who also happened to be Caucasian. She asked how I knew this, our president. And my husband said, well, she works with him. And she goes, oh, so are you his scheduler? And so biased, right? And so I share the story, not in any way to shame her, but to say, even if, and I don't know her experiences. So, it certainly was a biased comment, but I don't know her experiences. But so I chose to make it a teachable moment.
Yes.
But one of the points that I try and make when I share that story is that when you are using cultural intelligence to manage your biases, in her situation, the way she would have managed that situation is to, when the thought came in her head, right? CQ would say, let me think about what I'm thinking about. So if I see you and I say, boy, I wonder if you're the scheduler or the secretary, I'm going to, before those words come out of my mouth, I'm going to say, I wonder, why did I have that thought? Where did that assumption come from? How do I, so you think about it. So then when you process that in your brain, and we call it that system 1, system 2 thinking. So then the culturally intelligent words that would kind of come out of your mouth would be, so what do you do? The cultural intelligence center, because you could be the scheduler, which there's nothing wrong with that role, but I don't know what you do. So you could be the scheduler, you could be the president. I don't know. I'm not making any assumptions. So just tell me what you do. Let's start there.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I have so many memories now that are resurfacing. I'll share a bit. So before I came to coaching, to working in coaching and training, I worked for an investment bank, and then I worked for a broking company. And I guess I had a title, the kind of title that you had to explain a bit. So when you're at a event, even if it's a professional event, you hear broking company and you're like, it's not really a place where you have a lot of women, right? And yeah, I did have comments about just like the first comment, like you just described there in that situation. Are you the boss's assistant, right? Straight away, just going there. And it does happen. And there's so many things that you want to say, like maybe this would have been a good question to ask me.
I call them learning moments, a teachable moment. Do you make that, you have to make a choice in that moment. How do I want to handle this? And I'm going to make it a teachable without shaming, but also challenging them to reflect on their thinking and words.
And that's been
many examples.
It's been definitely a learning journey for me to even, reflect, or actually, I guess it was easier for me to reflect on what happened afterwards. And then the real learning moment was, okay, now I know that I can reflect, but how do I want to respond to that in the moment? And that's been a very deep learning. And, I'm sure I can still replay, conversation way better in my head now. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And sometimes it's not appropriate to respond in that moment. Sometimes, especially if you have a relationship with the person, sometimes it may be best. Let's say it's an event that was on a Friday night, emotions are high. You might have had a glass of wine and it just could go wrong, could really go wrong. So maybe it's when we get back into the office on Monday and you pull the person to the side and say, can I just have a conversation with you? You said something and I'm just curious why you thought that. And this is sort of how it landed, with me. In that case, I didn't know I'd ever see that woman again. So I chose to make that moment and I was very respectful. She was an older woman, so I certainly didn't want to do, that's certainly not how I've been raised to disrespect an elderly person. But I did come back and say, no, this is what I do there. But I'm curious to know what made you assume that I was. So it challenged some reflection on their part. So hopefully the next time they encounter someone that looks like me, they may think twice or think out of what we call system 2 in the brain.
Yes, and people don't realize how these observations, just things that people say random in a party, can have a big impact on us in certain way. I have a situation with my girlfriend, my best friend in Italy. I was here in US already, and then I was visiting there, and I mentioned to her, now we were in a table with other friends, and I said, oh, one thing that I love about the US, that you see a lot of doctors, lawyers, and even looking now around the city that are from so many different places, like Indian doctors and so many. And she did like a very Italian gesture saying like, come on. And I react in a not good way, as you were mentioning. I stand up to the table and I had to take a minute. And afterwards, we talked and I said to her, the way you said, because I'm a foreign now, and I live as a foreign in Italy for 12 years. It looks like that who doesn't belong
sure
cannot be someone else. Like have a good position, a good profession. And anyways, but
so it's not just the words, the tone, even, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
For sure.
Yeah. Very good. So we were going with the quick questions and answers. So very briefly with whatever comes to you, to your heart, to your mind. So the first one is belong for me is?
Yeah, belonging for me is a space where I can bring all of who I am to an experience, and that there's no shrinking back, and that the environment is such that it celebrates and embraces that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Celebrate.
And I'm not asking permission to be there.
Yes.
Okay.
Beautiful, beautiful. The best advice that I receive and that I like to share with others is?
When you show up, be courageous enough to bring you with you, and do you.
Oh, I love this.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think with that said, obviously, we started out talking about the importance of cultural intelligence. So there's obviously that skill that we need to be able to adapt to our environment so that we are more effective. But that does not equate to being a chameleon or not being your authentic self. So having that balance.
Yeah.
I think that's really important for people to understand.
Beautiful, great reminder. I love the bringing you with you, right? Love
we often think about bringing others with us, and we often forget ourselves on the way. Yeah,
exactly. Lastly, the world would be a better place if?
I actually had to write some notes around this one because I was thinking about it, and what it came to me was I said, people, it would be a better place if people didn't fall prey to the false notion that when you invite others in, right, and when you give them a seat at the table or you create space for them at the table and give them a voice, that doesn't take away from them. I think people often resist inclusion and belonging out of fear. That means that I'm going to lose, that I'm going to have to give up. And I qualify that by saying you don't lose. Now, if injustice is a factor, then there may be things that you might rightfully need to give up. But generally speaking, when you invite others in and you embrace who they are and what they bring to that experience, you can do that in ways that does not take away from you, and we all still win, and we're all better. We're all better as a result of that.
Beautiful, excellent. Thank you so much, Sandra, for being here with us. Such amazing nuggets of wisdom, so many things that we will take away and hope that other people will watch this and have a heart with more cultural intelligence and compassion and empathy as well. Thank you.
Really means a lot to
My pleasure.
have you had
I can't
today
wait to see how this evolves.
Thank you for listening to the Belonging Project podcast. We hope you enjoy our deep dive into belonging and listening amazing stories from our guests.
We'd love you to share about the Belonging Project with your friends and colleagues. And also, we'd be delighted to connect on LinkedIn and share more about our experiences. Thank you again, and stay tuned for the next episode.